Rack City, ladies and gentlemen. What you see here is a brand new power steering rack and all of the components required to swap your car from a manual rack back to power steering. This poor old 1987 LX hatch that I've nicknamed the Average Fox, shout out Infamous Project, I stole the name from him, was treated to a manual steering rack at one point in its life. It also got treated to some real custom bracketry and idler pulleys. I guess you kind of got to hand it to him for the ingenuity here. Anyway, all that junk's coming out of here. This car's currently got a 245 wide tire on the front of it, and it's not all that enjoyable to steer around parking lots and or anytime you're at low speeds. So we're going to try and make it a little bit more enjoyable with a brand new power steering system.
Put the needle on the record.
Okay, so we're back on all four wheels. Now you just saw me remove my tie rod ends from the spindles. That's step one, okay? Now you very well may have a different situation than me. Maybe you're working on a garage floor and you're still on jack stands. You by no means have to put the tires back on right now. I just did so I can utilize the lifting capabilities of my 4-post hoist. And I don't have a belly jack, so I gotta fart around a little bit. Now, I know folks that are going to watch this and try and emulate what I'm doing are going to come from all different skill levels. Now, I just want to make it clear to you folks, like, this is not a difficult job. This rack is very, very simple to change. It's literally held on by two great big long bolts that run through the K-member. There's nuts on the back side here. All right, we're going to be removing those. And then in this case, because we're just removing a manual rack, the only other connection we have is steering wheel to steering shaft to rack. Now this thing, I didn't realize this, but it's got some sort of an aftermarket shaft in it. If you got a stock or what resembles to be a stock car, you're gonna have a rag joint right there. But anyway, this thing, I think it was on its way to be a race car. It had a long ways to go. Manual rack and a upgraded steering shaft. That's about it. Right, so now I'll show you on this rack, power rack we're going to be putting in. This is what the top end of that shaft looks like coming off the rack, and your steering wheel to steering shaft slides over this spline. We ultimately need to remove that, okay? And then we're pulling those big long bolts out of here, and then we're going to pry the rack off the K-member.
All right, so we got just a minor little hiccup here I wanted to point out to you. The bolts that hold the rack on are running into my sway bar, so I'm gonna have to loosen off my end links from the lower control arm and ultimately rotate this out of the way to get the bolts out. But other than that, this rack is ready to come out. You can see I've got the shaft, steering shaft off of it, right? It's come off that spline there. And we've ultimately just pried these bolts, or pardon me, loosened these bolts and pried the steering rack off of those pins. So sway bar is going to get loosened off here, and then we can get this rack out and start installing our new parts. Rack's out. Now, I just want to pass on a quick little piece of advice, and it's got to do with these sway bar end links. Okay, And I think these things somewhat get overlooked and don't get the attention that they need paid to them. Now, I'm also going to pass on a little bit of an old timer's piece of advice that was given to me as a young lad, and it goes a little something like this. Every 20-minute job is one broken bolt away from taking all bloody night. And not that I broke any bolts, but taking sway bar end links off of lower control arms is a really simple thing to do. However, because no one has taken into consideration the fact that these sway bar end links are way too long for this car's suspension setup, and not that it's some exotic setup, but it has been lowered. These are stock length end links. I think these are actually just straight up stock replacements. They got no sleeves on them. Typically the energy suspension ones have sleeves and they're a little more beefed up. Anyway, because these things were so long, they just gave me all kinds of grief trying to get them out of the lower control arm. So 'tis the case. Mechanics day one stuff. But anyway, I got them out. Going to be putting some new sway bar end links on this thing. These are like 30, 40 bucks at your local parts store. So just biggest thing is make sure you get the right ones for your car. Okay. This sway bar, when the end link's in the lower control arm and ultimately in the upper sway bar hole here, it should be somewhat parallel with the lower control arm. Okay. Not bent way up or bent way down. Like your sway bar is literally doing nothing if it is not parallel. I've also noticed that, check these units out. Those rubbers are absolutely shot. So we're going to be getting a new set of those too. This is the thing, right? You're doing one job and then all of a sudden you notice something else that needs to be tended to. And while you're at it, you may as well do it. It's also the rabbit hole that I talk about probably way too much. You guys are getting tired of hearing that out of my mouth, but anyway, here is the old manual rack. I had an assumption that this was a Flaming River rack. As it turns out it is. I don't think it's all that old. Typically these racks, if you're removing a stock one that's like came on the car from factory, they can be quite difficult to pry off. Like they bind pretty good on these rubbers, and these rubbers will rot out, but these ones don't look rotted at all. I'd guess this thing's probably been in the car maybe a couple of years. So anyway, that's the old one. Now I'm going to get the new one put up here beside this one. We're going to get some rough measurements as far as where the tie rod is set up. Now I didn't mention this earlier, but we're not going to be reusing those tie rod ends. We're actually going to be slamming one of these bump steer kits on it. So we're going to leave these on there. But what we're going to do is set the other rack up here and just get a rough idea where the toe setting is on this rack. We're going to be ultimately putting the Quick Trick alignment toolkit on her and doing a little alignment on this car once this new rack's in, because that is a key component that you need to have done once you swap your racks, or you should anyway. Okay, now I've removed a little package that this rack comes with. All right, comes in this little bag, and LMR, actually I've got one of these racks from CJ Pony Parts too. I think they get them from the same supplier. Anyway, they come with this little filter. Now you can run it, you don't necessarily have to. I mean, stock systems don't come with any filter. I don't know, I kind of see the filter as just yet another place that you can have a line leaking, but to each their own. This is not the point of me making this important service announcement, if you will. This guy here, okay? Now, most people look at this card and think, oh yeah, whatever, toss it, right? Don't do that. Because you see those two little white Teflon O-rings? Those are important, very important. So much so, I got a whole nother set right here, okay? These are the O-rings that ultimately go on these lines. Oh, and would you look at that? These lines even come with them installed on them. Okay, and this is literally, that is one of your seals. That rubber one in there is your other internal seal. But this one is like pretty much the most important and the most forgotten. And I did a video on these, on how to warm them up. You need to like warm them and kind of work them, open them up to get them on those lines. I'm actually quite excited that those lines came with them on, because it is kind of a pain in the ass. But anyway, I'll give you a link to an old video of mine that shows you how to do that. You can do it with a heat gun. You can do it with really hot boiling water, soaking them in the water. But just be forewarned, okay? If you don't have new lines, you're going to be needing to utilize these. They're a one-time use, and you have to replace them on those lines or you'll have a leak. And power steering leaks aren't fun. So make sure you pay attention to that. Now, like I said, we're going to try and get this new power rack set up in a similar manner to the old rack. And we're going to be putting these new spherical joints on there, which are ultimately part of this bump steer kit. The rest of the kit, they supply you with essentially a new bolt, a tapered bolt that goes into your spindle. These are your spacers. I did a whole video on that. I can give you a link for that as well on how to set these up. Every car is a little bit different, but they give you all these different shims in order to set your tie rod end angle up for your specific application. So watch for the link in the top corner of this video as well. Now, like I say, I'm just going to spin these on. We're just going to run these in a little bit. We're going to back the spherical joint out. We're going to make sure that we're roughly the same setup as the old rack. And then finally, what we got to do is make sure this rack should be set up in its center point, but we're going to make sure of that, okay? So I'm going to get on here with some soft jaw pliers, and I'm going to turn this all the way to one side, count my turns, come back the other way, and find the midpoint. One thing I kind of left out, but I think it goes without saying, is you should have your steering wheel in a straight manner when you go to start this job. I'm not tall enough to open my door, but I've got my Quick Trick alignment steering wheel lock from the seat to the wheel, steering wheel, holding it straight right now. Just because I can change all that when I do the alignment too, but you may not have one of these Quick Trick alignment toolkits, and you may have to depend on your local alignment shop to do this for you. So you're going to be driving over to the alignment shop with a cockeyed steering wheel. But this, making sure that you're dead center here, is way more imperative, because you ultimately, if you don't do that, you got to pull the shaft off, turn this, try and get it back on, and it's a pain in the ass when it's all up and in the K-member. So a couple things to note there. All right, folks, as I was going through doing this, I come to the realization that I really need to find a way to get a cameraman, because 2 arms are just not enough to do the job and film these how-tos. But for what it's worth, I'm going to try to explain to you what's going on. I have removed the sleeves that come from LMR, in this case, that come out of these polyurethane bushings, okay? We're going to pull these. We're not going to use them. So those can be set aside. I've pulled them out of both sides. Now, for what it's worth, the trick that I used is get yourself a 1/2-inch socket, pretty much fits on this hole perfectly, and put like a 1-inch socket behind it. So essentially this is what's going on. These are in here, and your 1-inch socket sits here. Your 1/2-inch socket pushes this steel sleeve through the polyurethane bushing. Put it in the vise. You need, you're holding a lot of things at once, but anyway, that's the best way to kind of break those things loose. So for what that's all worth, get those sleeves out of those polyurethane bushings. Now, I've removed the polyurethane bushings from the passenger side of the rack. Okay, so this is the way the rack goes in the car, like that. So I've removed these. The one that's missing is over, up and on the sleeve that's in the K-member, okay? Now I've removed this sleeve from the driver's side of the K-member, and it's sitting right here. Now, all of this is, the reason I'm doing all this is just because these polyurethane bushings can put up a pretty good fight because they're stiff, like they're really hard. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna slide the passenger side up and on the bushing that's already on the sleeve that's through the K-member. And this side we're gonna leave loose, and we're ultimately gonna pound this through the polyurethane bushings and through the K-member. I'm probably gonna clean this up on a wire wheel just to make life a little easier so I'm not driving rust through these bushings. But that's kind of the program that's taken place off camera. So I'm gonna do my best to try to show you how to slide this guy in there. Now, something else you need to keep in mind is you don't want to go all the way in with it, because we've ultimately got to put our high pressure and low pressure lines on the rack still, okay? This end and this end. That end's going up to the pump, so's this end. So we got to get these guys on there. Now, you can put them on before you start putting the rack in, but it's just one more thing to bump your arms into. And you don't really know how they're going to be in there. You can see they're kind of bent on 90s almost, right? They do need to sit in the K-member in the appropriate fashion so that they can ultimately come up and go to the power steering pump. So I recommend putting the lines on once the rack's half in place. Okay, so just a quick little tip here for you. So this blue and black plastic plug that ultimately block off your inlet and outlet for fluid, those are supplied with the rack, and they're in there for shipping purposes, just to keep the junk out of your rack. Now, I just want to, for what it's worth, make sure you keep those in when you're running your rack up and into place. You can see how, even though I was careful, there's dirt that are on those plugs now. Had I not had those plugs in there, you would have been dropping dirt down and inside your rack, and well, you'd probably be buying another rack. So just keep those plugs in there before or while you're putting the rack up in place, and then pull them out when you're ready to put the lines on. Okay folks, I gotta lay on a sword here. Admittedly, it's been a little while since I messed around with a manual rack, and I'm hoping that by me mentioning my massive oversight, I can maybe save you some time and effort and or overnight parts orders. But manual racks actually have a different size male shaft than that of a power rack. The manual rack shaft is smaller than the power rack. So I'm in a situation here that's kind of brought me to a standstill. Now, I did have to take this off regardless to clock it. However, it will not work even if it's clocked, because the female portion of this is too small. So I've reached out to some buddies locally here to see if we can find an intermediate steering shaft stat. If not, we're doing the overnight parts order. Now, that said, we still have a long ways to go, right? We've got all the top stuff, the accessory drive stuff, power steering pump, bracketry, all that good stuff to install. So we're not going to stop here. I'm going to bring the car down. We'll start farting around under the hood and placing all this other stuff in there while I get this intermediate steering shaft situation figured. I gotta be honest with you, I made some fun of this whole pulley bracket system when I started the video out, but whoever did this, I gotta hand it to him. I mean, they definitely worked with what they had. You can tell here that they weren't dealing with a bolt bin by any means. I mean, these just came out of the junk drawer. But overall, I mean, this thing definitely served a purpose. Like, it's, I wouldn't call it engineered. I mean, these spacers, it was like, you know, it was a bit of an afterthought. We had to add some spacers after, but it works. That's the amazing part. And I guess the special part with it too is, hell, you can't knock it if it works. I mean, they repurposed this bracket and had it, you know, clocked in a different direction. It just, yeah. As I took it apart, I had a little bit more of an appreciation for it. So whoever built that, if you ever watch this video, good on you.
Okay, folks, time to drop this pump in here. Now, we're using, this is the OEM non-AC power steering bracket, right? Now, you guys seen this in whatever form it was on here before. I think it was something to that effect with this whole pulley. No, it might have been spun around the other way. Anyway, pretty ingenious thinking when you really boil it all down. Now, we're putting it in OEM format, and I don't have any of the OEM hardware here, so I'm just using some lock washers and nuts that I've got in my bolt bin here to loosely mount this bracket. And this bracket sandwiches the power, that might be a little far, sandwiches the power steering pump in between the cylinder head and the bracket that's mounted to it and to this steel bracket. So, in this guy goes here to there, and then we're going to run these long bolts into that aluminum bracket that's mounted to the cylinder head. Now, you really got to hold your tongue the right way. There it is. You guys can't see my tongue right now, but to get these bolts to line up sometimes, but I don't know, it's a lot of blind feel. Close your one eye, put your tongue on the side of your top lip, and let her rip. Okay, I think we got her. Okay, so I'm going to get these guys all tightened down, and then we'll run our hoses up, and then we'll get back down underneath the car. We got to remove the steering shaft, as I mentioned earlier. I got the new one in now. It's arrived, so we'll install that. And I'm going to have to take some measurements and figure out what size belt we're going to need. Here's just a quick look at what's going on up top. So my high pressure line is now threaded into the pump. One thing to note with this high pressure line is there's a supplied black rubber O-ring that needs to go on the male threaded end of this line before you run it into your pump. Don't forget that. The low pressure or return line has been put on the pump, and I've also put a hose clamp on there just to keep it nice and tight. And finally, I've got the high pressure line bracket that ties into the inner apron here. That's just to keep your high pressure line out of harm's way. Before we go on to the car here, I just wanted to point out the differences in the steering shafts. So this is only one portion of the one that was on the car. I showed you guys me taking it off. I was ultimately just trying to clock it, but then I realized that this splined female section is smaller on a manual rack than that of a power steering rack. So I needed to order this. And just for reference, this goes on here. I'm just going to give you a quick view of what I'm going to show you underneath the car here. So there's a bolt that runs through this hole right here on this intermediate shaft that we need to remove. Oh boy, right up here. Okay, we got to get that bolt out of there so we can ultimately slide this old shaft here out of the car. So bear with me. I'm going to get this bolt, the nut and the bolt undone, and pull this one off so we can get the new one put in there. Okay, so shaft's out. Now, for anyone that's done this, you know what type of a pain in the ass it can be to try to get yourself up and on top of this nut so you can back the bolt out. They're typically on, well, they're on opposite sides, right? So in my case, this is how it's sat in the car, nut on top, bolt on the bottom. Well, the voodoo magic that I use is I get this crow's foot up on top of the nut, and I get this down on the bottom of the bolt, and ultimately back it out that way. You know, you might be a little bit easier to get your arm up in there if you're just laying on the ground on jack stands, but in my case, I'm on a hoist, and well, you got to do what you got to do. So anyway, here's the old one, new one's going in. We're getting places. We're almost to the point where we can actually steer this thing with a little bit of power assist. Hey, what are you doing? And say hi. Okay. Our new intermediate shaft is in. She put up a little bit of a fight, but I won the battle. I've actually also, while I was down here, I didn't have a bell housing clutch fork cover on this car before, but had ordered one and just dropped that on there while I was down here. Now, one thing I should mention that some of you might be scratching your head over is this car has had the like power steering, you know, cooler line that runs up in the radiator support area. It's been removed on this car, so we are not running any type of cooling system on it. So that's why we went right from the rack on this line here up to the low pressure return side, and not down and over into your cooler. So if you've still got the cooler, that line's going to come over and tie in here and then go up to that low pressure side. But anyway, we got to get this rack put in. Sorry about the light here, folks. I know I'm kind of blinding you, but I got to pound this back in. I got to put a bushing in here, ultimately run the big long bolts through and tighten this rack in. And then we've got to complete this bump steer kit. So we got to install the studs up on the spindle and space them out so we can get a correct steering angle. And oh yeah, right, I got to get some new end links for this damn thing, and then a belt, and we'll be in good shape. Okay, so we've got the studs from our bump steer kit installed on both of our spindles. All right, pretty straightforward. Tapered end goes up into the spindle and the shaft end hangs down below. Now, the shaft is ultimately going to receive a combination of these shims, all right, and then followed by a lock nut. Now, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to correct this tie rod end angle to be parallel with this lower control arm. You can see right now it's up, so ultimately we need to bring that tie rod end down with the shims to correct for that angle. And the best way to do that is with your car on the ground under full weight. I've done a full video on this, folks. I'll give you a link for it up in the top corner. You can go there and check it out. I explain everything. But essentially, I just wanted to give you a quick little look at what's going on underneath here. I think probably most people at this point in time have messed around with one of these kits. But if you haven't, check that video out. I'm going to get after, well, what you got to do is essentially you got to keep pulling this end off, which can be a little tricky to do when you've got full weight on the car. Hence the reason I've got these. So I'm going to be taking some weight off. Got to like really yard on this to get it off, put shims on, try it, and get yourself situated with whatever combination of shims you need to use to correct for that angle. Essentially, well, I pretty much need to come down about there, right? And so whatever that space is up there, I'm going to make that up with shims and then ultimately bolt this guy down. Okay, let's bleed this power steering system for the very first time. Now what I got going on here is I've ran a chunk of hose from the return side of my pump down to a drain pan just to catch anything that might come out of there. And the actual return line that comes from the rack that typically goes on this return side of the pump is also down in the drain pan. That is the one that we should be getting most of our fluid out of. This is just more or less a catch. Then we're going to fill our pump up with ATF and we're going to rotate this pulley by hand, okay, to load this pump up with fluid and pump fluid down into the rack. And while doing so, we're also going to rotate the steering wheel, okay? That's going to help get the rack loaded up with fluid. And we're also, in my case, I'm a little spoiled with my quick trick alignment tool because these plates are on ball bearings and they allow you to steer the car very easily under its own weight. You may have to lift the front end of your car off the ground to do this, but that's essentially the process. Okay, we're back together. System's bled and full of fluid, and we also have a belt on it. Now, I did this off camera, took my measurement, but I thought it might just be worth explaining. If anybody out there is curious as to how you go about getting yourself a belt measurement, you pretty much get out a piece of string or rope. In my case, I use this, okay? Tie yourself a slip knot, wrap it around one of your pulleys. In my case, I use the alternator pulley, and then I just trace my rope through the pulleys as you would run your belt. Pull it tight. You can factor in your tensioner if you're running a tensioner. In my case, and everyone's is going to be a little different, I needed a 72-inch belt. But I always recommend when you're buying belts, just so you save yourself a few miles going back and forth to the parts store, whatever measurement you think you need, buy one bigger and one smaller, and then return the ones you don't need. It'll save you time. You can thank me later. So anyway, this is all now back together. I also, because I kind of got carried away on a phone call with my buddy Bill Butler, I set up my Quick Trick alignment kit, okay? And now, for any of you that missed my video on the Quick Trick Alignment Toolkit, I'll give you a link for it up here. You can go and check it out. Essentially what I'm doing here now is just getting my tie rod ends in the correct orientation so I've got the right toe on this car. And again, you can see it in my video, but you get yourself with this version of the Quick Trick tool or alignment toolkit that I've got, you run yourself a string from your back tire, which is obviously solid in a Foxbody, solid rear axle, and you pick yourself a number. In this case, I'm using the 3-inch mark on my rulers. I run my string up to the front,
Okay, you also use 3 there. And then you come back here and you can see I'm a little over 3/4 of an inch out. Okay, so in that case, my wheel is out. My passenger side, I haven't looked actually. I'm actually not too bad here. Okay, I'm using the same 3-inch mark, and I'm just a little bit out here. So not much needs to be changed here. But the next step of this process, I'm obviously going to adjust my tie rod ends to correct for that. And I need to check for leaks before I fire this thing up. I will check it for leaks again once I get the car running and pressurize the system, but we have bled it and loaded it up. So any initial leaks at the rack or anywhere else we're going to see right now as I lift the car up. I'm hopefully not expecting to have any leaks, but nonetheless, we're going to check. All right, folks, I'm just going to give you, I was going to give you a quick look at a dry power steering system, but you know what though? I don't think that's a leak, especially being that it's on that high pressure line. I think that probably, yeah, you can see the filter. I think you can. Filter's got a little bit of drip on it. That's when I pulled my drain hose off of the return side. At least I think and hope. Pretty sure. But anyway, I'm just bringing you under here to give you a final look as we inspect for leaks, right? Obviously check your connections right at the rack. I think everything looks pretty good under here. We're in good shape other than that one little drip, so we'll deal with that. Anyway, I'm going to get after adjusting my toe here on my tie rod ends. Unless you've got a quick trick alignment toolkit, you're probably taking your car to an alignment shop if you've done something like this. But with all that being said, I highly recommend this quick trick alignment toolkit. I can't say enough good things about it. It is the slickest tool that I have in my toolkit, quite honestly, to do this and or a full-blown alignment, right? Caster, camber, and toe. Yeah, can't say enough good things about it. All right, folks, well, I'm going to leave this one here. Thanks so much for watching. If this video helped you out, or you think it might help somebody else out there that's got a car that had a manual rack swap and they've got to go back to power steering, please send this along to them. That's why I do these videos, just to help the community out. It's my way of giving back. And I appreciate you guys all. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you on the next one. Take care. Bye for now.